My name is Valérie Bélair-Gagnon, and I'm Associate Professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. In my talk with the Demystifying Media speaker series, I talked about mental health in journalism and the importance of creating different forms of strategies and tactics to be able to disconnect from the online connections, online and social media work that a lot of journalists are going to have to do in their careers. So we talked about the ways in which the work can be very intense for a lot of journalists, can lead to different forms of harassment for media workers, and we looked at how media organizations are responding or not responding to these different forms of harassment online, and talked about the way in which disconnection from online connectivity and digital capitalism has become a form of digital labor that is often not acknowledged by news organizations and has become something that journalists use as in their toolkits to be able to remain sane and reconnect with the communities that they want to cover. So a disconnection is not like a complete form of disconnection, so it doesn't mean that you completely turn off from social media, but it could mean that you're developing different tactics, like you can turn off your phone for a couple of hours. You can decide to block or mute certain users that may be harassing you. So we went through all of these different tactics that journalists are using in their daily work. But we also in the talk, the argument, which actually comes from a forthcoming book that I have with Diana Bossio in Australia, Logan Moliner and Avery Olton, who are professors in U.S. institutions, and we talked about the ways in which these forms of active journalism can be recognized as part of journalism labor. So that was this is the kind of main argument of the book. So when I started 14 years ago my PhD in journalism studies, a lot of us were studying the ways in which innovation can be integrated and adapted by journalists in news organizations and freelancers. And one of the main finding that a lot of us in our field were having is that journalists are not adapting, and that's a problem. With the internet and later on in the late 2000s and early 2010 with social media, we found that it was really important for journalists to adapt to social media. But I think, kind of adopted a sort of a techno-utopian vision of how journalists should be using social media. And later on, we found out that it was, there was some glimpse of darkness into that, so to speak, where we found that people were anxious using digital technology. There were groups of journalists that were potentially less interested in adopting this technology, which led to other kind of issues like possibility to advance in their career. And with social media in the 2010s and with rise of populism around the world and rise of hostility against journalists, you saw an army of trolls and different forms of harassment emerging or becoming more prevalent in the work of journalists. And so we thought that at this point we needed to take a stand, and we needed to be able to look at the ways in which journalists could become more resilient, and news organization could have responses, and the way that tech company could respond to these issues that journalists were experiencing. So we shifted our research from kind of a techno-utopian focus to more of what is the dark side of journalism, and how can we make it so that we can still continue to cover our communities and perform the roles of truth seeking, and perform the roles that journalism do in our democracy. So we decided to become more critical there's the trend now that people have decided to become more critical and say we need to really assess the problems that comes with the uses of the internet and social media, and to really think about the ways in which it is changing the labor of journalism and how can we make it work so that the profession can continue to do the good work that it does for society. The paradox is that with all these forms of connectivity, we found the emergence of different forms of journalism. And there's so many ways that now we can do journalism, like journalists are on TikTok, but or on Facebook or Twitter, and you have entrepreneurial journalism. You have a lot of ism that exists in the world because of the emergence of social media. But the paradox is that with all the possibility to connect with different communities online and through social media, there's also the paradox, there's also all the arms that comes with it. And with all the possibilities of thinking about social media as a potential for the future of journalism, and for its not only for its democratic purpose, but also for its as a revenue generation, also comes the paradox that it's making everybody exhausted. So the idea of the paradox is that, with with connection also comes different forms of disconnection, in the way that people try to go through disconnection as a way to reconnect with their community. There's a lot of opportunities for journalists, news organization, professional association, and government, and even platform companies to improve the life of journalists. And I think that right now what we're seeing is that there are professional association like the International Women Foundation, the International Center for Journalists, Trollbusters in the US, and many other organizations are taking the lead in trying to prevent harm for journalists through training, through awareness, through representation of different cases of journalists, and so on. And right now what we're seeing is that there are opportunities at so many levels. I think one of the big opportunities is in education, where in journalism school you can include more mental health and well-being awareness into the curriculum at every step of the way. For a news organization, the big issue would be to have more of a systemic approach to preventing and talking through each of the assignments for journalists to help them work through some of the dark side of the internet. And for journalists, it is really about improving their own resilience and learning the skills and having the tools in their toolkits so that they can learn to be happier in what they're doing. So one of the thing that we've been thinking and talking a lot in my work, especially with the work that I've been doing with Avery Olton at the University of Utah, is to have a public health approach to mental health. And I think that when you're thinking about the media industries, often talking about mental health and well-being can in such a high pressure job can seem like it's something that is quote unquote soft, but in fact it isn't soft, because it is affecting the bottom line of news organization, and especially in the abilities of media organization to enroll new employees, find talented new employees and retain them in the future, which causes a lot of issues if people are unhappy and decide to leave the profession. One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is to think about mental health and well-being as a public health problem rather than an individual problem. So what that means to think about mental health as a public health problem broadly, it means that every little step counts, and you have to prevent and create different mechanisms to prevent and to deal with potentially harmful things that are happening to journalists. So when every little step counts could be kind of micro changes that news organizations make that don't take too much time in this high pressure environment, such as rotating teams around comment moderation or curation. So by rotating people in a team looking at comments, the positive effect that it has is that it creates empathy to understanding what other people are going through when they're looking at harmful comments online. And it also creates peer support. So you can talk about that with your peer and share experiences with them. So micro changes is I would say is a first, we found that is a first step in which organization can think about mental health in journalism in an effective and relatively simple way. I think that what we're finding is that there's not one way, even within the U.S. or Europe or the global South, there's not one way in which people experience things similarly. And I think we have to be aware of the cultural differences and the complexity of the problem in different political, cultural and social environment. So when you're looking at mental health or well-being in journalism, there's not a one thing that will fix everything, but there are probably multiple solutions that will allow for us to think about these different issues. While our research has focused more on the global north, there's a lot of important stories that needs to be told and bolstered and integrated in the conversation when we're thinking about well-being in journalism that comes from the global south too. So I think that for students, it is important to understand the risks and the opportunities today, but I think that a lot of it has to come through education and through what I've discussed earlier, the idea that universities need to include ways in which students can think about a culture of well-being and advocate for that in their work. So not only can it go through educate universities or schools to bring awareness to mental health and well-being, but also I think and provide resources for students to be more resilient as they're entering a high-pressure industry. When it comes to mental health and well-being, the burden should never be on the individual. It should be on it. We're part of a collectivity. We're part of a profession. So the burden should not be on the student. The student can learn skills, but the goal is to bring that well-being mindset in news organization and advocate for it, and asking and looking at cues and clues in media organization where they would potentially be hired, or if they decide to go freelance, to be able to advocate for themselves through professional association and other kinds of groups that can help and support them into fostering that culture of well-being in the long term. Well, right now we're really focusing on that book that we're going to publish next year in 2014 called The Paradox of Connection. So in that book, we're looking at these different forms of connection. But looking forward, I think one of the projects that I've been working on with Avery Olton is to look at resilience through resistance in the context of online harassment and the ways in which we found that in some cases people journalists have resisted against the army of trolls, and so we're curious to learn more about how within that culture of well-being, people are taking things in their own hands and resisting against the troll culture. So that could mean that, as a concrete example, some journalists have told us in interviews that they are when they are being harassed, let's say on Twitter, and get DMs from trolls and harassers. They would publicly put the information of trolls online, and sometimes that would open a conversation with the trolls. Sometimes it would the harassment will subsidize the acute form, and the different forms of harassment will subsidize posts taking things in your own hands. That comes with privilege because you have to be aware as a media professional what are the social media policies that are in place in the media organization. But we have noticed this trend where people have become much more have resisted to this online negative culture. And that's something that we want to explore more and look at what are the tools that people are using and what contexts are they able to resist to online connectivity.